I don't think it's there anymore, but it used to have a big kind of pool and fountain in the middle. So they bathe in the fountain, and people throw coins in the fountain, so they collect the coins, and then during the day go out and buy food. So it's a very well thought out plan for a 13-year-old. But the crux of the story is that while they're there, a new exhibit opens at the museum, which is that they get a donation of a very small Renaissance sculpture of an angel, which is believed to possibly be a lost Michelangelo. And so it causes a big to-do in the city and in the press. So Claudia and her brother now have a mystery to solve. So is it really a Michelangelo? How could they figure that out and prove it one way or the other? And who's this mysterious Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler of the title? She's the person who donated this to the museum for a tiny amount of money, like $200, for something that could potentially be a priceless work of art. So Claudia needs to know the answer, and they embark on an investigation to see if they can figure it out. And as is often the case in stories like this, they find that the pursuit of the answer is actually almost more worthwhile and more rewarding than finding the answer at the end. Mrs. Frankweiler, of course, becomes a very important figure in the story towards the end. The kids do meet her, and her mixed-up files of the title are an important part of how they go about their investigation to determine whether the statue is actually real or not. And Mrs. Frankweiler is also a very important sort of archetypal character for this kind of children's book, because she's that wise adult figure who is not a parent. So therefore they can have a relationship with her and learn from her and take her advice more as a peer than as an adult. So it establishes a different kind of relationship. I think you'll never really visit a museum in quite the same way again after reading this.
I believe that's based on a true story.
It kind of is, yes. At the time, this is back in the 60s. At the time this was written, the Metropolitan did receive a donation for a very tiny amount of money for a Renaissance sculpture, much like the one in the story. It did not turn out to be a Michelangelo, but it was still a big thing in the news at the time. And although it's not that the story itself is true, but it's an interesting sort of background tidbit to the author, is that Königsberg was, much of this is autobiographical. She lived in the New York area, was raising her children, and she was taking art classes in New York. So she would take the train into New York, take her kids with her, and while she was doing her art class, she would drop the kids off at the museum, and they could explore and see the art.
All alone?
All alone. And she would pick them up on the way home, and they explored the museum and learned about art. And one day when she picked them up, she happened to notice the kind of thing that, only an author would see, these little details. They were looking at an exhibit and noticed that there was some popcorn behind, like in the exhibit behind where people were allowed to go. And so that got her thinking of what kind of situation could possibly have brought that about. And so she took that tiny little kernel, if you'll pardon the pun, and turned it into a story that ended up being one of the most cherished stories of the 20th century. So that's from the mixed up files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler by E.L. Königsberg.
Great, thank you. Really quick, lightning round. What was your favorite childhood book?
Oh, well, that was one of them, but the other one would probably be Charlotte's Web by E.B. White.
Okay.
Phantom Tollbooth. I don't know who the author is.
Norton Juster.
Norton Juster.
Okay, yep.
The Weston Game by Ellen Raskin.
And mine is actually Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, as well as the E.B. White. And
all of which are on my list.
There we go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect.
Excellent. So why don't you give us another taste?
Okay, another taste. This is a startlingly lovely book called Alzheimer's Through the Looking Glass. And it's a biography both of a mother-daughter relationship, but also of the disease of Alzheimer's itself. So the author is Dana Walrath, and her elderly mother, Alice, who's this beautiful Armenian woman, comes to live with her when she can no longer take care of herself. So the book's title is a play on both Alice's name and the kind of surreal experience that you going through the looking glass into the world of Alzheimer's. So Walrath uses quotations from Alice in Wonderland itself mixed in with her text, and she also even uses the text itself to create her artwork for the book. You can see in this one that she's wearing a dress as she remembers her husband in years past. She's wearing a dress that is made out of Alice in Wonderland text, and this she wears through the book. One of the points of this book, which is in a series called Graphic Medicine, is to show Alzheimer's patients as something other than the scary kind of brainless zombies that we tend to make them out to be. The author says in her introduction that she has set out to reframe dementia as a different way of being, as a window into another reality that lets people living in that state be our teachers, useful, true humans who contribute to our collective good. And this book definitely does all of that and more. It'll really surprise you. She portrays her time with Alice as this time of healing and magic and even humor, as this other picture will show you. Alice is very focused on food. She wants to eat all the time, but she only wants to eat what she wants to eat. And she's never liked dogs in her life, but she's managed to form this alliance with Herbie, the family dog. And so you can see in this picture here, she's saying, "Dana, Herbie ate my lunch. Do you have any ice cream?" Because she always wants ice cream. So, there's just these little glimpses into the humor of the situation, which come more frequently than you would think. So the book is Alzheimer's Through the Looking Glass by Dana Walrath.
Karen, I want to ask you a question.
Oh,
so
yeah.
it's part of a series, so there are other books that...
Yes, there are other books that deal with other diseases in this series called Graphic Medicine.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Beth's turn.
Yes, you are next, Beth.
Okay. So my second nature human book is not about animals this time. It's about trees, and it's not about anybody trying to be a tree, although that may come in the near future. But it's about the wood wide web. The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Voleben in here he describes how trees feel, how they communicate, and how they help each other through life. An example of the wood wide web is how an entire forest can communicate with the trees. All in the forest can communicate using the fungus growing on their root tips. They send out chemical signals. It's a fascinating book in which he has gathered research from scientists around the world and from his own work working in German forests for over 15 years. You can feel his awe and his love of the trees in his writing. He discusses how trees are both individual and social beings, how they nurse their sick, how they lavish love and attention and restrictions on their children, and even take care of their dead.
It sounds almost, I actually read this as well and loved it too, but it's almost like he's kind of anthropomorphizing trees.
Absolutely.
in a way.
As you can tell from the paragraph where
Yeah.
that I read about talking about his children and caring for them. But he pulls it off because he sticks with the scientific research and he uses it to explain complex biological problems. And he makes it thoroughly enjoyable by doing that. And as the Washington Post reviewer said, frankly, right now, nature needs every little bit of help it can get. So if Voleben's decision to anthropomorphize nature gets more than 500,000 Germans to care about forests and ancient forests, I do hope he can do the same for Americans. So that's The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter
Voleben.
Leanne, what's your second book?
Who tells your story? This has been a very resonating question that has been very popular this past year because of Hamilton, which is the Broadway musical. And Ann Patchett has written a book called Commonwealth, and this plays that question, who tells your story, plays a pivotal role in that novel. Patchett is known for a variety of books. Her exotic locales brought you to amazing places in Bel Canto and also in The State of Wonder. But here, she does something that's a bit closer to home. She traces the evolution of an American family in 5 decades. And you wouldn't think that would be very enthralling, but it truly is. Her 7th novel opens with a door opening into this very small house. And there's a bunch of people there, and Fix Keating has expected all of them. Most of them are cops and their wives, because they're all there to celebrate Franny, his youngest's christening. And when the door opens and he looks over, he sees Bert Cousins, a near stranger, and he says to himself, what is he doing here? He's standing there on the threshold carrying a very large bottle of gin, which of course is very welcome. But when Bert meets Fix's incredibly beautiful wife, Beverly, there is a tectonic shift in both households. Bert is married. He has 3 kids with 1 on the way. And what happens because of their meeting changes everybody's life. And it's really about the repercussions of the breaking asunder and putting back together again of this family. The 6 children grow up together, and almost like a pack of feral wolves, or feral dogs, I should say, is how Patchett puts it. And she does a really wonderful job of evoking how difficult this is, but also how amazing it is when you get to choose who's in your family and how that works. I would have to say that it goes back and forth over and over again to who tells your story, predominantly because Franny gets involved with the novelist, and there's some repercussions from that, and the kids, as they grow up and live their own lives, hear their own story in a way they never thought they would, and that causes quite a few problems.
This sounds like one of those books that would be hard to sort of classify.
Yes.
And particularly because she always writes something a little bit different. Who would this particular one appeal to, do you think?
Well, I think if you love to read about characters and their choices, this is a really good book for you, because that's really what's happening throughout the entire novel. But also, she does something about the way she weaves place and detail is really, she just has an amazing way with her words. And I think that it will appeal to people who like place and setting as part of the characters. And you know, like I felt the trickle of perspiration as I read that first chapter about, you know, in that little Los Angeles house in the summer. But also the way she uses oranges as both metaphor and as the physical orange is very, very, well, it's just ingenious. And you smell and taste them throughout the entire novel. You think to yourself, this is just a simple story about 2 families, but she does so much more with that. She makes it into a universal story with a lot of universal themes about how really people grow and how you develop into who you are because of the human beings you are bred with, even if they aren't someone that were born to your own mother and father. But she does a wonderful job with that. What is difficult about this is that it is told with constant shifts in point of view. So if you're someone who needs, you know, more linear stories, you're going to have to be patient with it, but it's well worth that. There's a peripatetic chronology, and she jumps in, and all of a sudden there's more and more characters being added to the pages.
Wait, so is it actually different perspectives? I mean, are you actually getting it told from different perspectives, or is
it's a third-person point of view, so it's an omniscient author, but it really feels like a variety of unreliable narrators, which is one of the reasons,
and we
of
know
course,
how much you
yes, why I enjoyed this so much. But this was a wonderful surprise for me, because I knew that Patchett would always write a very good novel, but I had no idea it would rise to the top of my list, because it was just such a stellar effort of writing. And a wonderful experience. She captures the absurdity and the heartbreak of domestic life in a way that I very rarely get to read. So it was a lot of fun as well. So I think we have a final
one.
Our dessert, I believe.
Dessert.
Yes.
Dessert is another collection of stories, called Flashed, Sudden Stories in Comics and Prose. And the first thing you have to know is where the title Flash comes from, and it comes from the idea of flash fiction. And flash fiction is really, really short fiction, like somewhere between 200 and 1,000 words, so not even your average sort of short story, much shorter. And so it's the idea of flash. It's a little bit like a game of telephone. It's the editors started by commissioning, for instance, a comic artist. And the comic artist was asked to draw a comic on a subject of their choosing. And then the editors took it and passed it on to the second person in the game of telephone. And the second person was an author. And the author has to react to the first piece, to the comic, and riffs on it in whatever way he or she feels like doing. And then that piece, the piece of writing, is then passed on to a third artist, and in this case another comic artist, who hasn't seen the first one, only the second one, and riffs on it in their own way. So what you end up with is this triptych, as the editors call it, a group of three, which acts as one. And they are sometimes really closely related, because they are, or they're not. Just a tiny little thread will kind of run through the three of them. And then what you get at the end is the contributors actually commenting, like reading over through the whole group and commenting on what they thought of the whole triptych, which is really interesting. That's actually one of the most interesting parts of it, to see whether they liked it or didn't like it, and they're pretty frank. And speaking of contributors, there are some really great ones in this book, including Junot Diaz, Steve Almond, Amy Bender, and Carol Lay. So the variety of artwork styles is huge. I'm not even going to try to give you a sampling because they're all so different. But it's not a straight up graphic work. If that's what you're looking for, that's not what you're going to get here. But if you're looking for sort